Now, if you've ever read the book of John, which I imagine a lot of people have, you notice Jesus does a lot of referring to Moses in the Gospel of John. So as we read the book of Exodus, we want to see all the pointers toward the future, toward the new covenant, because a lot of what is laid down in the book of Exodus is a type of what is to come. And I'm using that language of type of what is to come because that's the language Hebrews uses when it connects the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. In the book of Acts, over and over, we're told that the apostles would be preaching or teaching, and they would be arguing that, not arguing like as in having an argument, but an arguing as in building a case, that they would argue the resurrection of Christ from the Old Testament. And a lot of that is found in the book of Exodus. So can you imagine hearing a sermon preached on the resurrection of Christ, using all the Old Testament references and the prophetic references to that? That would be fascinating to have heard that. I'm not saying that's the only way you'd want to preach it, but that would be a great thing to hear. So we're looking at what is coming forward. So there is this Mosaic covenant is going to come in the book of Exodus. And the sons of Levi are going to be the ones that carry it out. So then in verse 2, so the woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a beautiful child, she hid him 3 months. So that was about as long as she could hide the fact that she had had a son. This is following up on that the sons are to be thrown in the river. So that's from Exodus chapter 1. So, verse 3, but when she could no longer hide him, she took an ark of bulrushes for him, daubed it with asphalt and pitch, put the child in it, and laid it in the reeds in the riverbank. Now, we have the ark. We've already had one story about an ark, Noah's ark. And then here we have, and it signifies this vessel. And so we have the ark. Here we have the Ark of the Covenant, which is going to come. It's a container, it's a vessel, it's something to carry. Peter also makes reference to this, that through baptism we go through, and that's a type of ark that we come into relationship with Christ. And so an ark in the Scripture begins to symbolize some effect of God's saving grace. That's important to remember that because it's an important theme. It's not a disjunct theme, but it goes throughout the Scripture. And when she makes it of bulrushes, as I was reading this week, something new that I had learned, that these were tall reeds. They were several cubits high. A cubit would have been a measurement from a fingertip to an elbow, so somewhere about 1.5 feet. That's a general understanding of a cubit. And the inside they actually could eat. It was almost grew in like a triangular shape. And then the Egyptians even hauled some of their boats and small boats with the outsides of these reeds. So for her to make an ark out of these reeds was something that she would have known and said, well, this is what we're going to do with this child. And then she put pitch and asphalt on the outside. But then interestingly enough, we also see in this chapter, and then on into chapter 3, God's providential hand at great work among this family and among Moses. And that's something that we want to make sure that we take notice of, because we want to know in our day and time, where is God leading? Where is God calling? Where is God intervening? Because we see it here in the past. That doesn't give us a pass that, what will be, will be. But are we in tune with what God is doing? And so his sister stood afar off to know what would be done to him. Now, another thing that's interesting is they don't just put him anywhere in the river to float on down the river. They put him in a calmer spot, and they may have even had this sort of plan in their mind, or God had led them in this plan. They had it where near where Pharaoh's house was, because Pharaoh's daughter comes. And here when it says that, I'm going to get to that in a minute. I almost jumped ahead. I got excited about something. I almost got ahead on myself. But so they put him in the river here, and Pharaoh's daughter comes. So then in verse 5, would someone read verse 5 through 10?
Okay, so then the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, and her maidens walked along the riverside. And when she saw the ark among the reeds, she sent her maid to get it. And when she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby wept. So she had compassion on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." So the maiden went and called the child's mother. Then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me. I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him. And the child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. So she called his name Moses, saying, "Because I drew him out of the water."
All right, so Moses' name is literally drawn out of the word Masha, which is to draw out. And so he's drawn out. You could say drawn out by God's grace, even though working through a pagan princess. So we see God's, again, his providential hand, his working in the events of human people, but we see he's also sovereign over it. And he even uses this pagan princess in order to preserve Moses' life. And all of these things come together to really shape and form Moses uniquely into who God needed to lead his people out of Israel. We talked a little bit about that last week, and we'll get into it a little bit more this week. But, so the daughter of Pharaoh came to bathe. Actually, the language there behind bathe, the word that they use there is the same word that's used in Hebrew that signifies ritual ablution. So like ritual washing that would be a symbol of taking away of sin. Now, it would have a different connotation for Pharaoh's daughter. So she may not have just been down there to get a bath because she had BO. She was probably at the Nile River for some kind of ritual washing. And the Egyptians looked at the Nile River, especially in its flood stage. Now I'm blanking on the god's name, and I don't think I wrote it down. I think it was Happy. Yeah, it was Hapi. Easy to remember, right? That when the Nile River was at flood stage, because the flooding brought fertile silt up in for the fields, they regarded that as like a god of fertility. Anyway, so that she was down there for this ritual washing. They looked at this, since it was the god of fertility, that meant it was life-giving. The Nile was life-giving, and in a sense, it was, not in a spiritual way or that it was God. They looked at it that way, but it was life-giving. So she was probably doing some kind of ritual down here, and she and her maidens see this child. In verse 6, and when she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby wept. So she had compassion on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." So she knew that this was one of the Hebrews' children, and she had compassion on him. And she even makes him a son. So she obviously does not have this hatred for everything Hebrew. But she takes him in. And then Moses' sister's hanging around. And I don't know if you've seen pictures, but I know I had a kid's Bible, and as a kid, there's the sister standing in the reeds watching what's going on. And so she actually comes and says, "Do you need a nurse for this child?" And there his parents get an extension of getting to raise Moses. So he would know where he came from, that he was not just somebody taken in by the Egyptians from where else, but he was a Hebrew. And, really, no one other than God could work that out. and see that that would happen. Because in those days you didn't just go to the grocery store and get formula. You needed a nurse, and so his mother becomes that nurse. And you can imagine then when Moses goes away for 40 years and he comes back, I guess you could sort of assume that his parents were gone, but he reunites with his brother and his sister who were Hebrews. Then in verse 10, and the child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. That's most likely after the child had weaned. And I didn't really get into looking at it, but some cultures, kids don't wean until quite a bit older than when we weaned them. So he might have been 4 or 5.
Question.
Yeah.
So they put Moses in the basket because they were afraid he was going to be killed.
Right.
But they get him back to take care of him. So would they have explained to Pharaoh that that was Pharaoh's daughter's baby? Or how did they protect the baby after that? Because it would have been back in the same household, in the same situation.
Yeah, but we're kind of led here in the text that they didn't know that. Pharaoh didn't know who his family was. So they had him till he was weaned, and then Pharaoh's daughter came. Came for him when the child was weaned. And then he's given the name Moses. So we don't know what name he was given, his Hebrew name, but we know the name that Pharaoh's daughter gave him because she drew him out of the water.
We really don't know the parents' names of Moses, do we? First and last.
Yes, we do. It's Amram and Jochebed. But that comes from...
Can you spell that?
Yeah, no, I can spell it.
I didn't know that.
They are mentioned later,
Okay.
and that's like in chapter 18, I think. Don't quote me on that. It's either chapter 10 or chapter 18.
Yeah, just it doesn't tell you.
I didn't remember the numbers there. I didn't memorize that part, but yeah.
Okay, so he does have parents' names.
Yes, we do. We do have his parents' names, and in fact, his mother was also. How was this?
They were Hebrew, right?
Yeah, his mother was also his aunt of some extraction. We're gonna get to that part. That's on down the road. I decided we would deal with that when we get to chapter 10 or 18, whichever one that is. Because if you start going down every rabbit trail, oh boy, and I have 6 commentaries sitting on my desk on Exodus, so that I have pulled off the shelf. So if you start reading all of that, then your mind starts spinning a little bit. So we'll deal with that, but with his parents. But yeah, I'm pretty sure his father's name was Amram, and his mother's name was Jochebed, Jochabed. Yeah, Jochebed.
Way to go, Mark.
I didn't know I was going to get a test today. Like,
We don't have a clue.
Details are important.
this is Bible study, not Stump the Preacher. No, I'm just kidding.
Details are important.
No, they are, and it helps you remember. It does help you remember people when you have a name. Now, in verse 11, then the story changes here. Would somebody read 11 through 15?
One day after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were and watched them at their hard labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Glancing this way and that and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. The next day he went out and saw 2 Hebrews fighting and asked the one in the wrong, "Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?" The man said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? You are thinking of killing me as you killed that Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, when Pharaoh heard and thought, what did I must have become known? When Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and went into Midian, where he sat down by a wall.
A well.
Oh, a well,
Yeah, thank you.
sorry.
Yeah, it could have been a wall, but it was a well. Yeah. It was the wall of the well. There we go. That's the tactful way of doing it, right?
I got that crazy ointment in my eyeballs, so.
No, you're good,
I'm
Sharon.
trying.
Now,
Sorry.
the other thing about Moses being raised as a daughter of Pharaoh, he would have been in the Egyptian court. And we mentioned a little bit about it last week. I mean, he would have had the best education in the world at this time, and he would have had the best training in government matters, in diplomat matters, in military matters. I mean, it would be like going to West Point, maybe even more than that. I mean, he was trained for leadership. And I know last week, I think Tanis mentioned something about him being a general, and as I was reading this week, you there, Tanis? Oh, I thought maybe you were asleep, which is
No, I'm
okay.
here.
It's 1 o'clock. It's the
I've
1
been awake
o'clock
the whole
hour.
time.
Yeah. So, but Josephus, the historian, the Jewish historian, was the one who recorded that even, and I don't know how reliable historians think it is, but I'm just telling you what Josephus related, is that he had been a general that when there was an uprising of the Ethiopians, which is south of Egypt, Moses was the one that led the army there to defeat the Ethiopians and reconquer land from Ethiopia that they had conquered from the Egyptians. So a little bit of a history there. Well, we're not sure about all the details of that, but nonetheless, Moses was trained for leadership in the best place that he could have been in the ancient world at this time. So then he goes out, and you can imagine if you had this education, you were in the royal court, you might be tempted to kind of think you could get away with things that you wouldn't get away with. And then he comes and he still knows that he's a Hebrew. And he knows that they are his brethren. And he sees an Egyptian beating him and he kills the Egyptian. Wrong move, but God's able to work around it, able to work in spite of that. And then he thought nobody saw it, but some other Hebrews saw it, and they were fighting, and then they get hostile with Moses, maybe not knowing that he's really a Hebrew. Maybe they did know, we're not told. But we see here, this group of folks is having a hard time getting along. and so Moses, once he knows that, hey, this thing's known, this is going to get out, and then we're told that Pharaoh knows about it, and he wants Moses' life. Where does he flee to? Midian. Now, does anybody remember anything from the end of the book of Genesis about Midianites? Has to do with Joseph. Well, the traders that his brothers saw coming from afar were Midianite traders. So the land of Midian it's thought that they are descendants of Abraham through his second wife Keturah. And that's in the book of Genesis. I can always remember Abraham's wife Keturah because Sarah and I have this Bible trivia game. We got it not long after we were married, and we play it. And when you play that game, you go, wow, I am really ignorant. Because they ask the most obscure questions at times, and that was one that I had forgotten. And then, you read the book of Genesis, but you don't retain everything. So like 10 years ago from then, I could remember because I got that question wrong and I lost the game. Anyway, so.
You'll have to loan that game to Karen and I.
Oh, maybe I'll just bring it for a Bible study one day and we'll all play it. Maybe that's what we'll do. Maybe in December we'll have a little Christmas party and then we'll play the game first and then we'll end on a high note by having a little party. We'll eat the pizza and ice cream after the game. And then everybody will set their New Year's resolution to read their Bible with more detail, right? Anyway,
The well, not the wall.
yeah, there we go. So, anyway, the Midianites, they descend there from Abraham, which I think is likely, But anyway, they were also connected with the Ishmaelites, and most biblical scholars think that the Midianites were they were connected with the Ishmaelites in some way through marriage. And so we see they're the ones that sell Joseph into slavery, because they're first mentioned as Midianites, then they're mentioned as Ishmaelites in the book of Genesis, probably to communicate that connection there. So he goes to the land of Midian. This is now east of the Red Sea, sort of to the south of Israel, to the east of the Red Sea. We're there in the wilderness, and what would be the northern part of Saudi Arabia today, probably. So he goes there and he sat down by a well. And anybody remember the significance of wells in Genesis?
Is that the well that they put Joseph in, his brothers? Or no?
Probably not the specific same well, no, because that was a different territory where they lived. But anybody remember what happened at two wells in Genesis? Not any specific wells, just they had this event.
They got filled in by the Arabs.
Yeah, Jacob's well was filled in by the Arabs, yes. But well, so when Jacob went to Laban, that's where he met Rachel, was at the well.
Yep.
And when Abraham's servant was sent to find a wife for Isaac, where did he meet Rebekah? At a well. What's another well that we remember in the Bible?
Christ talks to
The Samaritan woman, yeah.
Mary Magdalene was, or no, that wasn't
Well,
her.
no, it was a Samaritan woman, yeah.
The wells were the
So-
New Testament version of social media.
The well, yes. This was the public center, and you think about it, water is necessary for life. So your meeting place, when there's a well, that's where you're going to see people. That's where things are going to happen. This is where conversation, yeah, their dating app, right? Yes. At least people could talk to each other then. I always joke the normal kids are the ones that are like the Amish kids, because you go talk to them and they look at you and they talk back. And once they know English, other kids are doing this all the time. I only make that joke because I went, this was like 10 years ago, I went to shoe a horse for a Dutchman. And when I got done, I was like, the kids were the only ones home. And I said, so do I leave a bill with you? Can I leave a bill? And they're like, no, Dad left us the cash. And this 11-year-old pulls out this wad of cash to pay me. And I'm like, your dad left you with all that? Like, oh my goodness. Anyway, so when I think about, kids doing things responsibly and, having conversation, and I think of Amish kids. But anyway, that's okay.
We have a
Put
lot of
Jeremiah down
Amish.
a cistern, is that a well also, a cistern, a well, Jeremiah?
Yeah,
Didn't they drop him down one?
They dropped him down a cistern. Yeah, the only difference is a cistern just collects rainwater, whereas a well, it goes down to the water table. Yeah. What were you gonna say something,
No, I
Tance?
was just gonna say, we have, when we had the driving clinics over at Doc's, we got Amishmen come, and they brought their kids. I have never, ever seen an Amish kid talk back, throw a fit, cry because he couldn't have something.
Yeah.
They've always been the most polite little
Yeah.
kids that you'd ever want to see.
Yeah.
That's not to say you're perfect.
No, not at all. Not at all. Well, we'll stick to the book of Exodus. I know it's easy to take the rabbit trails. But anyway, the land of Midian, that's where he goes to, and he comes to this well. And now I have to figure out where we are. Okay, then in verse 16, now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water, and they filled the troughs to water their father's flock. Then the shepherds came and drove them away, but Moses stood up and helped them and watered their flocks. So the shepherds were like, we want to get our animals watered. You're going to wait for us. We're going to get this done. And so Moses helped them. And when they came to Reuel, their father, he said, how is it that you have come so soon today? And they said, an Egyptian delivered us from the hand of the shepherds and also drew enough water for us and watered the flock. So Moses helped them, and he got it done faster for them. So he said to his daughters, and where is he? Why is it that you have left the man? Back in those days, hospitality and the culture of hospitality was a big deal. If somebody did something like this, you wanted to return the favor. I think we probably still have a little bit of that today. Call him that he may eat bread. And in the Bible, when they say eat bread, usually it symbolizes even more. It means a meal, not maybe just only bread, but bread would have been a huge part of their diet. And then Moses was content to live with the man, and he gave Zipporah, his daughter, to Moses. So very similar to the stories of Jacob and the stories of Isaac and Rebekah. And she bore him a son, and he called his name Gershom, which literally means stranger there. For he said, I have been a stranger in a foreign land. So another thing, we've talked about the name Moses. We've talked about now Gershom. Names in the Bible signify character. A name is not just a label, but it symbolizes the character of the person. And that also counts for God as well. And we'll probably talk a little bit more about God's name next week when we get into the second half of chapter 3. So God heard, I jumped ahead here. Now it happened in the process of time, verse 23 starts a transition, that the king of Egypt died. Then the children of Israel groaned because of the bondage, and they cried out, and their cry came up to God because of the bondage. Now this is literature here, and not just literature. I'm not saying it's just literature like anything else. But there are literary devices used that Moses uses in writing this biblical narrative. And, one of that is, did their cry literally come up to God? But he knew it ahead of time. He knew that they had a cry, but using that language makes it very poignant that, okay, now God's going to do something because he's hearing it. Well, he's heard it all along. He's known their need all along, but it's a colorful way of describing that now God's going to do something because God's on the move on this. So the king died, and that means that Moses would be able to go back to Egypt. By the way, Moses goes into the land of Midian, and what's his job there? He's a shepherd. So the Egyptians really detested shepherds. They thought that was way beneath them. It was dirty work. So, when Jacob's family comes, and I came across this when Jacob's family comes down to Egypt to be with Joseph in that famine, and they're given the land of Goshen. Because they are a shepherding people, the Egyptians probably wanted to have Goshen where you have your spot, we have our spot. You stay in that land. So when he goes back to Midian, or when he goes to Midian, and he's from going there from Egypt, he's going from one extreme to the other. Not just socioeconomically, but he's also going to the other extreme of where he might have even been picking up from the Egyptians this, I don't really care for shepherds, they stink, kind of mentality. That's just being funny, but that is very true, that they didn't care for the shepherds. So he's going, and so you can imagine for him, this probably was a distressing situation leaving Egypt. Going somewhere, going to the unknown, fleeing because you're hated, you're wanted. You're wanted back in Egypt. And so here he comes to Midian, but then Reuel, which is later Jethro, gives him his daughter. He has a son here. And then in verse 24, we'll carry on there. So God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham. Again, God didn't forget he had a covenant with Abraham, but he remembered it, and that's our way of speaking, giving it a colorful that, okay, God's going to do something because he's remembered it. He is conscious. He's going to be doing something with this covenant. He hadn't forgotten it. So from the human perspective, they might have thought, well, God's forgotten about this covenant, but he hasn't forgotten about it. He's going to do something here with Abraham, Isaac, and with Jacob. So those are the three patriarchs. And God looked upon the children of Israel, and God acknowledged them. Kind of sum that up, those three verses. You think about, it's been several hundred years now, and now God's going to act on this covenant, these covenantal promises. After having that break in time, God is going to prove himself faithful in an even greater way, that now he's going to bring the people out of a very settled situation. I mean, it's settled. They're in Egypt. They're in a bad situation. In other words, the Egyptians have, planned the demise of God's people. But God is going to be faithful. He's going to bring them out of that, and he's also going to bring them into a land of flowing with milk and honey. So it's a very, it's a good opportunity to look at God's faithfulness. So having a conversation with some folks the other day, and they were talking about how, we live in heavy times. Most families might have a heavy situation going on in them. It's heavy politically, it's heavy socially, it's heavy culturally. There's a lot of, and people feel that. And, but it is looking at what God has done in the past. You can imagine here having, over 300 years of what's God doing. That reminds us that we're not to become discouraged, and we're not to become dismayed, that God is still capable. God is still at work, even if we feel like we're in a time that's difficult. And I'm not going to share any answers on this, but I often think of the question of, in the midst of it, regardless of what time you live in, there's something difficult about every time period of history. How do we maintain our joy even in the midst of it? Because we remember our joy is not, as Christians, is not surrounding our circumstances, but joy comes because of the person of Jesus Christ. And he is the same yesterday and today and forever. So just want to remind us of that. I would like to start into chapter 3. We've got about 10 minutes left here. I just want to check this. Okay. Just want to make sure, because I'm headed to Laurelbrook here in a little bit for the service out there, and just needed to check to make sure they were good on their end. But let's go into chapter 3. Would somebody read verses 1 through 6?
Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And he fled the flock to the back of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire from the midst of a bush. So he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, but the bush was not consumed. Then Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush does not burn. So when the Lord saw that he turned aside to look, God called to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Do not draw near this place. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place where you stand is holy ground. Moreover, he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God.
Okay. So in this chapter, we begin to get Moses teaching on who God is. Moses wrote the book of Exodus. That's the traditional view. I view it that way. I believe he wrote Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. But he really begins to share with us and put ourselves, not just looking backward, but put ourselves in the place of those reading in this day, what we're learning about who God is. So, first thing though, when Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, now we have a different name for Moses' father-in-law. It was Ruel, and then in Numbers, it's spelled Raguel, like Numbers chapter 10, somewhere around in there. The very most basic explanation there is that Ruel was his given name, Jethro was his leadership priestly name. So, don't ask me how they proved that, because I read a lot of different pieces on the explanation of this, and I thought I'm spending way too much time on a smaller detail. So I decided not to go down that rabbit hole anymore. But I think that's probably the best explanation. So now he's referred to as Jethro after this. And he led the flock to the back of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. So it's thought that this is the same mountain as Mount Sinai. The names are used interchangeably. And it was known as the mountain of God. And most shepherds would not be on this mountain. Like, it was pretty much an untouched place. But Moses wanders there, well, not wanders, but goes in there with the sheep, with the flock, and he is feeding them there. And then he has this experience in verse 2, and the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire from the midst of a bush. So this is the first step. The angel of the Lord is sent and brings this fire, and there's this burning bush that is not being consumed. So there's a miracle here. There's something miraculous going on. The laws of thermodynamics aren't being used right here because the bush is not being consumed. So when we think about a miracle, 100 years ago, liberal theologians thought, well, we have to reconcile everything with the modern scientific age. So they started to remove all the miracles out of the Bible, and then you wind up with nothing, and that's some of the reason why we went from UMC to the GMC. So that was very popular in the 1920s and even leading up to them. So when we think about a miracle, you don't have to be one or the other. So people say, well, if you believe in miracles, you don't believe in science. Or if you believe in science, you don't believe in miracles. Well, that dichotomy doesn't have to be. You could believe that there are natural laws in our scientific world, in our world, but you can also believe there are times when God interrupts his scientific laws on the ways that things work. So God interrupted it here. And that was with this angel of the Lord. And this burning bush was to get Moses' attention. And once he turns aside in verse 3, then he hears God call from him from the midst of the bush. So we have a transition from the angel of the Lord to then God's voice. It says, Moses, Moses, and he said, here I am. So that is a typical response of somebody who's being called by God. We see that with Samuel. He thinks Eli's calling him, God's calling him, and he says, here am I. So the first thing about that fire is God's presence is going to be compared to fire in Scripture to teach a truth about God, that he is holy and that he is pure. Because fire purifies, fire empowers, and God in his holiness is completely pure. There is no sin in God, and in his holiness, he is separate from the creation. And he is the only one who is holy. So in and of himself, so any person or thing that is holy is because God makes it holy. So there again, we tend to do one or the other. There's a group that would say, well, people aren't really that bad. We're all good. And then there's other ones who would say, oh, no, people are never holy. Both of those are wrong, because the only reason why believers are holy is because God makes them so. Okay, so we don't want to jump to one extreme or the other. So we're beginning to see the holiness of God laid out, that God is holy. Then when he comes to verse 5, he says, "Do not draw near this place. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place where you stand is holy ground." So people will often wonder, well, why in the world, what was the big deal about the sandals? Well, it has to do more about the ground. That where God is, God cannot have anything sinful in his presence. So he says this is holy ground, not because the ground is holy, but because God's there and makes it holy. In other words, God's saying don't drag any of the other dirt from other places into this holy ground because they can't mix. So sinfulness and holiness can't mix. So in other words, and I think I wrote down a quote here. Give me a moment to find it. Okay, here's a quote. This comes from Adam Clark's commentary, from Adam Clark, and he told him to take off his shoes. Therefore, and it's because you don't have to mix that other dirt with this holy ground. In other words, it is emblematic of laying aside the pollutions contracted by walking in the way of sin. So laying aside that walking in sin and taking off those shoes in order that what is entering God's presence is coming into his holy presence without sin. And then God said, moreover, he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. So he knew, that nothing sinful could be in God's presence. And in the book of Exodus, we're going to have it laid out how the people come into the presence of God through sacrifice, through faith, and by God's grace. And then I think next week we'll pick up there in verse 7 and we'll talk more about God's name. But here we have it introduced that God says, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. So God refers to himself as the I am. And we'll pick up that theme next week and go from there. So, anybody else want to add anything? I'll turn this off if anybody doesn't want to be on the. All right.